Okay, this is David Sigg with offgridliving.com, and in this chapter we'll be assembling the solar cells. Okay, let's get started. We're now ready to start assembling the solar cells. This isn't difficult, but you do need to pay attention to the details and do this correctly. Done incorrectly, either the panels won't work at all, or you'll have a diminished return on solar energy. In other words, they're not going to work the way they should. The parts you'll need for completing this chapter. Don't worry, you don't need to write any of this down. There's a shopping list in the download section for this chapter. Okay, you'll need solar cells, of course, tabbing wire, bus wire, a Rosen flux pin, a staple gun, a soldering iron, solder, tile spacers, a handsaw, and a piece of cardboard at least 3 feet long. Once you've completed cutting your cardboard to the right size, place a solar cell near the end of the template. Position the solar cell so that it is evenly facing the end of the template. Once the cell looks to be even with the template, take a pencil and trace around the solar cell. Be careful not to place any pressure on the cell itself. They break real easy. After you've traced the cell, remove it, then lay it next to your trace, leaving about a 1/4 inch gap between the cells, and begin to trace around the cell in its new position. Rinse and repeat until you have all 12 solar cells traced on your template. Next, take the tile spacers and place one on each side of the traced out solar cell within the 1/4 inch space. Use the staple gun or the stapler and pin the tile spacers in place. Using the tile spacers will allow you to easily keep the cells aligned. As a result, you'll end up with a more professional looking solar panel. Okay, now we're ready to start soldering the cells together. After finishing the template, you can start soldering the solar cells together. Before you begin this part, for those of you who may not know, the top of most cells is the negative side, and the bottom is the positive side. You'll be hooking these cells up in a series. A series connection is an electrical connection where the positive terminal of one device is attached to the negative terminal of the next in a series string. Hooking up your solar cells in this fashion will increase the voltage output of your solar panel, allowing you to successfully charge a 12-volt car battery if you needed to. Tip number 1. It's a good idea when working with solar cells to wear some latex or vinyl gloves to prevent damaging your cells as well as burning yourself during the soldering process. Tip number 2. If you bought pre-tabbed solar cells, you can skip the next steps. I'm including this step for those who didn't. If your solar cells did not come pre-tabbed, you'll have to solder the tabbing wire on each individual cell before assembling them. So, plug in your soldering iron so that it can warm up. Place 2 solar cells, one in front of the other, on the template. Roll out enough tabbing wire where it is the length of the 2 solar cells. Cut the tabbing wire at that length. Once you cut the first strip, use it as a guide and cut several more pieces the same length. Now you can begin soldering the tabbing wire on each individual cell. Alright, so take one solar cell and look at the positive or bottom of the cell. The positive side usually has a number of small white squares. Then take 2 strips of tabbing wire and lay them on each side of the cell. Take your Rosen flux pin and add 1 layer of flux to each of the white squares. Now take your tabbing wire and lay it across the cells vertically. Each column will receive its own strip of tabbing wire. Once you have the tabbing wire in place, simply solder the tabbing wire to the white squares. Follow the same steps for the second column. It should now be looking like this. Rinse and repeat for all of the solar cells. Do all the cells in advance before moving on to the next step. You should now have 36 solar cells with tabbing wire on each. Okay, place one solar cell at the starting end of the template and another cell directly in front of it. Take the tabbing wire on the first cell and place it on top of the second cell. After positioning the tabbing wires from the first solar cell on top of the second solar cell, use the Rosen flux pen and apply one layer of flux on top of the two thick white lines of the second solar cell. Next, take your soldering iron and begin to solder the tabbing wires down directly on top of the thick white lines of the second solar cell. Alright, rinse and repeat with one cell after another. The tabbing wire from the last cell goes on the top of the cell which comes next. Okay, here's a tip. It's wise at this point to use your digital multimeter to make sure you are producing the right amount of voltage after you solder each cell together. Take a look at the image below on how to properly check the voltage of two or more cells hooked up in a series. Rinse and repeat until you have all 12 cells correctly bonded together. Once you finish a string of cells, always check to make sure how many volts you are producing. Better to fix an issue now than wait until the end. After checking the output of the first string of cells, repeat the entire process and make two more strings of 12 solar cells connected in a series. Your finished string of solar cells should look like this. You know if your solar cells are putting out the correct voltage? Your supplier should be able to tell you, and it is usually right on the product page itself or the packaging. For example, go to Amazon and search for solar cells. You'll get a page like this. Scroll down to the product section of the web page and you should see something like this in the product description. Once you know how many volts your solar cell produces, it's very easy to figure out the rest. In this example, the solar cell picture produces 0.5 volts, so two cells together ought to produce 1 volt. Therefore, a string of 12 cells should produce 6 volts. 12 times 0.5. So a solar panel, or 3 strings of 12 cells each, should produce 18 volts, 36 times 0.5. Rinse and repeat until you have all 12 cells correctly bonded together. Once you finish a string of cells, always check to make sure how many volts you are producing. Better to fix an issue now than wait until the end. After checking the output of the first string of cells, repeat the entire process and make two more strings of 12 solar cells connected in a series. Your finished string of solar cells should look like this. You should now have 12 solar cells bonded together in 3 separate strings. Take your time with this and do it right. Don't rush it. Make sure you use the multimeter every step of the way. Do this correctly now and you'll have a solar panel that will last decades with minimal care and maintenance. In the next lesson, we'll be placing the solar cell in the frame.